All right, we're gonna go now on to the next part. This is the lecture part. We first saw the movie Battle of the Algiers, which gave a overview of what colonial oppression looks like. And what is beautiful about this movie, also problematic, is that it shows a real-time image of colonial oppression. So we see militarization, we see divide and conquer, we see the use of media to spread a false narrative that the colonized cannot take care of themselves. They have to be under a colonial power to make it seem like it's their motherland, they're being taken care of. So what we were talking about, the connection between diversity and inclusion and decolonization is very direct. So right now we're going to go into the lecture part, which is going to show the colonial history of the world, in which we connect all these concepts that we talked yesterday about and that we're going to talk about today. So discrimination versus racism, you already heard all these terms, but there's a critical difference between discrimination and racism. For racism, you can also say sexism, you can also say various forms of Islamophobia, you can put a lot of isms on it. You can look at it from the perspective of patriarchy. I'm going to show you an overview in a little bit how these concepts that we know today are colonially created. So discrimination versus racism. If we talk about discrimination, discrimination is a form of unequal treatment, a marginalization or exclusion of people based on personal characteristics. But what is very critical to understand is that discrimination is seen as an incidental occurrence. One person can discriminate another one on various ways, but then when you go to racism, for example, racism assumes that people who belong to a certain othered group, so there is a dominant group and a non-dominant group. And what is very important to know with racism, patriarchy, sexism, all those concepts, that they are designed to be systematic. Yes. That they are designed to be systematic and institutional. Where you see, if you look at the West, you see that we're not talking about discrimination, because these discriminations have been institutionalized to form racism, and they are deeply embedded in policies as such as well. We will go into some examples in a little bit. So, we view in the West that is tarnished by colonialism, we see institutional racism as a colonial inheritance. Why do we see that? These are some news excerpts that I got from the media in the Netherlands that highlight how racism is institutional and how it affects our populations and also our views of diversity and inclusion. So here it says, white solicited with a criminal record has more opportunity to get a job or a higher position than an immigrant that is fully clean of any criminal records. This is a statistical evidence of how racism is institutionalized. We see this directly in the opportunities that we have. So then, VOC verslaat Apple. So that means the VOC, which is the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company is one of the originators of transatlantic slavery. That means the shipment of colonized people in Africa made to be slaves for the 100% profit of their labor in what the colonial factories are, which are the countries that have been colonized. And what is really interesting to see here, this is a very economic point of view. So also, maybe you know it, maybe you don't know it, but the stock market originates from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam. If you know the canals in Amsterdam, these are not just romantic canals. These have been trade routes for merchants that live in the big houses on the canals. So consolidating your profits and building a stock market, the VOC was the biggest company that facilitated and consolidated these profits. And what is very interesting to see, and also if you hold stocks today, if you invest in companies, the VOC, so the Dutch East India Company, will forever be the most expensive stock in the history of humankind. And why is that? Because all their exploitation is 100% profit. So what you see right now, they did many calculations. So stocks in the Dutch East India Company nowadays would be equal to 7,400 billion euros. There is no stock in the world today that can be worth that much. So you have to understand these exploitative mechanisms are very deeply rooted because they made a profit for the Western civilizations to build their nations. Another example. So this is an example within academia. This is also a societal example that says, who is afraid of red, yellow, and green? Geographies of redlining and exclusion in the Netherlands and Italy. So what redlining means, you have your society, but then when you see that colonially immigrated people come to the country, they see that they're treated very unequally. They are put into ghettos, they are put into socially impoverished places where they put a red line around the places where they live. You could also see that in Nazi Germany, when Jewish people were targeted and put into the Holocaust, that the government, so we're talking institutions, they redline the areas where people live and make sure there is no social economic mobility there. There's no chances of education, there's no chances of business, there is a lack of food, and many more things. So again, there is many evidence, there's a lot of evidence of these institutional efforts to keep people in an oppressed state. This is also a very critical piece, which I find really beautiful. And because we're here right now in academia, we all understand that the educational pipeline starts at kindergarten. When you're 4, 5, 6 years old, you start school. And when you start school, you have a set curriculum, you have set pedagogies, you have set methodologies, how children should be taught. And what is interesting to see in the Netherlands, while it is built on colonialism, is that it doesn't teach this colonialism. Rather, in the Netherlands, they speak of colonialism as the golden age. What that means, the golden age for the Netherlands, where there was enlightenment, industrialization, infrastructure, business, education, social welfare, upwards mobility. So they highlight very much from the age that you're 4 years old all the way till you go to university. At university, you can question it a little bit. That's why universities are very special places. But up until you're approximately 21, you have to relate to this narrative of the golden age. And what that does, here it says racial neoliberalism, social forgetting, and scientific colonialism in Dutch primary school history textbooks. So they erase this whole history to put forth this grand imperial history of the golden age. It was so good for industrialization. There was a period of enlightenment, and so forth and so forth. Never highlighting the oppression that it cost to build these nations. Then, the main question, because we saw the movie Just Yet, we saw the colonizing entity of France colonizing Algeria, dividing and conquering, oppressing, making sure that people don't have the right to self-determination. Then who decides what worthiness is? This is a very direct question to everyone here as well. Who decides for you what worthiness is? Is it a foreign occupier? Is it foreign investment? Is it a dependency scheme of a bag of money that is given by someone from another country? So, again, a little bit of history, because this has a very, very, very deep history. So, again, be mindful of the language that I use, because what you will see in dominant media, still today, you will see that colonization is framed by the West as exploration. People from Spain, people from Portugal, people from the Netherlands, from France, Belgium, they went all over the world to explore the world, to build an encyclopedic reality of what they see. They manifest that in written materials, they manifest that in media, and so forth. So here you can see that a colonizing conquest is started in 1492. So we're talking about approximately 500 to 600 years already, where there is a clear colonial intention. Believe that when Christopher Columbus ended up in the Bahamas, it was not only for the encyclopedic benefit of constructing science. This was very much also targeting the riches and everything that they see there. There is this image of El Dorado, right, which in the Spanish and in the Portuguese histories was regarded as these cities of gold in the jungle. There was this very yearning of these natural resources. So with that age of exploration, which is not an age of exploration, it's an age of yearning for these natural resources, comes then another period, which we call the period of scientific racism. Scientific racism was actually not even, it was a fundament of how science is constructed as of today. The pedagogies, the epistemologies, the methodologies that we use, all were dictated by scientific racism. An idea behind scientific racism, so an example of scientific racism is, let's say you go all over the world. Europeans were the only ones that accepted this framework of science, right? So you see then other people and you say, oh, you look different, right? My skull is different, therefore you must be different. So all these constructions have been created to create the European and the non-European. So we see that scientific racism has been manifested and widely used. So scientific racism was the standard of science from 1600s even up until the end of World War II. So this means who is the dominant one and who is the oppressed one, or the submissive one, or the non-human one, right? This is a very long time. And we still, until this day, deal with the effects of this scientific racism. And it also says, scientific racism in the 20th century has been widely deemed obsolete. If you look at your genetic code, all the genetic code is basically the same, regardless of the creation of race. But yet, it still tarnishes people and their lives till this day. So, yes, so colonialism, to give a little bit of a meaning to what colonialism means. And this you can, I made this definition, I slightly tweaked it to something that you can measure and that you can observe for yourself. So colonialism is based on free natural resources and free/cheap labor. So where you see natural resources being exploited by a colonial power, you see that they're basically not giving anything back in return. They're not caring for the nature, they're not caring for the backlash of any pollutions. They outsource all their pollutions, and then also labor is involved, right? Because if you look at the colonies as a factory, then the enslaved and oppressed people are its laborers. And the premises of colonialism is, this is very important, the denial of the right of self-determination. Self-determination means that a people, a community, people of a country that are native to their country can decide how their own life, what their own life should look like, what their own nature should look like, and how it should be treated. Therefore, you see that people who are native to the land, they tend to take care of this nature. They tend to have a very different lifestyle, so with respect to nature and the humanity around them. But when you see a colonizing entity entering the conversation, you see that the right of self-determination, a fundamental human right, is put in jeopardy. So, this is a very important picture because we just saw the movie and there was a question, okay, why Algeria, right? Algeria is just one part of the total picture. If we zoom out and we look at this 600 years of colonialism that we still deal with today, we see some actors that up until this day still have the same way of doing their business, holding themselves up to it. And what we then see in this very small peninsula, we see the Netherlands, the country that I'm from, England, above there, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. So we're basically talking about West Europe. If you then see their imperialist expansion, so their colonial expansion, it goes all over the world. So literally, basically every country of the what we now call Western world and the non-Western world has been affected by these colonial mechanisms. As you see, Africa has been subdivided seemingly by rulers where people just skirmished for their natural resources. The same we see with South America, the same we see with North America, who is now a settler colony. Europeans went to settle in North America, but again, this is where the fallacy of exploration comes in. How can you explore something where people already live? You're not the first one that discovered that. You are not discovering. Christopher Columbus didn't discover North America if there are already people living there. Same goes for many other places over the earth. If we look at Australia, it's the same. That's also a settler colony. A fun fact, who of you knows New Zealand, right? Everybody knows New Zealand. In the Netherlands, there is a province called Zeeland. It means land of the ocean. New Zealand is a settler colony from that very small little province in the Netherlands. So that's actually pretty funny because the Netherlands is right here and New Zealand is huge in comparison to what that little province was. So you can see the violence it takes to overtake these countries. So this is a global picture of how colonialism has affected the world and still affects the world. What we then go about is some concepts of how colonialism became a legal system as well. So we all know what a nation state is. A nation state is basically saying, oh, we have this culture over here. This is an attempt to get legal sovereignty, so we put borders around our country. We say, in the Netherlands, we like pancakes, we like to eat cheese, we like to cycle, but then 5 miles away, you don't like that anymore. So there's a little bit of cultural clash, right? So you put a line around your country. Some are divided by mountains, some are divided by man-made lines, and so forth and so forth. So with that comes the national identity of culture. And in those culture, there are customs. But what is very interesting, you see in Western countries, that the cultures that they build up have various colonial things inside them. So for one example, in Netherlands we have a celebration, it's called Sinterklaas, which basically has people, Dutch people, in blackface. So it's a racist celebration, and up until recently, people started to question that. Before hundreds of years, nobody questioned it because colonialism was the norm. So what you then see when you go from a nation state and you build a natural identity and you pair that with the age of exploration and discovery, you see that in the yearning of these European countries, in the expansion of them, European countries did not have the natural resources. There is simply no amount of wood, gold, diamonds, oil. All these things are not to be found in large quantities in Europe. So then imperialism came about. How can you make your European country the strongest country in Europe? And that is basically done by overthrowing other regions in the world and claiming them to be yours. That is exactly the same as we saw in the movie Battle of the Algiers as well. Because, again, going on to the right of self-determination, Algerian people, for the sake of this example, have lived in that region for many empires, different empires for thousands of years. And then a colonizing entity comes in and says, no, this is mine. Their fundamental right of self-determination has been broken down and made those people oppressed. Also, all of the other people that have been colonially affected. Let's see. And then, this is a very interesting point because you can trace this back in various different, also religious books, not books, but religious ideologies, and also very social theories that stem from Europe. So where the right to self-determination should protect their own people and make sure that they can govern their own lands, we see that European right to self-determination meant that they can overthrow the rest of the world. So Europeans basically told themselves, our right to self-determination is to do anything we want to do. And in that anything we want to do, they destroy the right of self-determination of the colonized countries, because they took away that right for the people to have the right of self-determination, all in the quest of these natural resources and free labor. So, we see that today as well. If you look at the media, also depending on what media you follow, but right now on social media, you see first responder media of what is happening. Why are these places taken over? What is the economic motives behind it? Why is this still happening? While we say that scientific racism is obsolete, right? But it's still in effect of today, and what we see right now in the Zionist attempts of getting a foothold in what is called Palestine. So, what that means, there is a significant colonial relativity, which says that exploitation guarantees pretty much 100% profit. That's how these countries have been able to build themselves up. And that's the same thing that we see today when we talk about oil, when we talk about gas, when we talk about minerals, when we talk about wood, when we talk, basically all the same natural resources that construct our world today. So, again, here you see again, why was the Dutch East India Company so big? Because their profits were 100%. They didn't pay the enslaved people because they were enslaved. They conquered large pieces of the world. They took all the natural resources of that and they put it in their own economic model. So that's why they call the Golden Age the Golden Age. Not because the Netherlands has gold, but because they metaphorically stole all the gold from all over the world. This brings a deep history and lived experiences with them. So, again, about decolonization. This is really important because we saw it in the movie pretty clearly. The French government had a media machine to tell the Algerian people, France is your motherland, France will take care of you, please have trust in the military, while they're oppressed by this same country. So there is a cognitive dissonance in that, that the oppressed people understand, no, we have to fight for our own liberation. And then when you fight for your own liberation, you're criminalized because you fight for your own liberation. So words and framing matters a lot, especially in this day and age. So we all know the words, the first world and the third world. We all know the words, the global north and the global south. I mean, these words are all embedded in diplomatic policy. These words are all embedded in when you go to the other side of the world. Oh, we're having a partner in the global south, or we're working with the global north. But what this actually means is the difference between colonizer and colonized. There is only one world. There is no third world, there is no fifth world, there is no 10th world. There is only one world. There is also no global north or global south, because as far as I know, Australia is down there in the south, if you take the North Pole and South Pole as opposites. So, these are the facets of power that are enacted through colonialism. And what I find really important to note, I already had mentioned the Golden Age. Yes, the Golden Age was golden for Europeans and settler colonies, but you never hear about the people that are colonized, because these people are left out of science, these people are left out of history writing, and also their histories have been erased by colonialism. So I dissected these facets of power in these 5 levels. So when you measure power, you can say there's geographic power, there's economic power, there's political power, there's social power, and there's cultural power. So what that meant for Europe, when we look at geographic power, you see nation forming and imperialism. Economically, that meant the fallacy of discovery and trade. What I just said, how can you discover something when somebody else is already living there? It's like you're living in a house and some stranger comes to your house and says, I discovered your house, now I'm gonna live in here. Politically, that means the expansion of political power, so legal force is behind that. Socially, that meant the Industrial Revolution, which all of colonizing entities benefited from, right? The industrialization, making sure that everybody has food, warmth, housing, water, and so forth, and so forth. Culturally, that meant the Enlightenment. If you look at European scholars and if you look at European philosophers, they're still very much embedded in this colonial thinking. What is very interesting, and you never see this anywhere, is what that meant for non-Europe. Because the European model or the Western model is like, ooh, it's modern, it's grand, it's so good, and everything is well cared of. But for non-Europe, geographically, that meant the destruction and annexation of also sovereign states, countries, and regions. A good example of that is Indonesia. In the colonial war of the Netherlands and Indonesia, Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands. When Indonesia gained sovereignty that was acknowledged by the world community, the Netherlands attacked Indonesia and basically said your sovereignty is invalid. What that meant is the destruction and annexation again and the oppression again of those people, even though they already had legal sovereignty. Economically, that means the exploitation of natural resources, enslaved and indentured people. So you see the enslavement and exploitation was merely an economic model for Western Europeans. It was, oh, that is just a country on the other side of the world. We don't have to deal with this humanity because those people are not human. That place is not ours. We can do as we want. So their right to self-determination was the infringement of the right of self-determination of these people colonized. Politically, that means the disruption and forceful denial of self-governance. We saw that again in the movie because they were talking about the FLN. That's the Algerian party that fought for their own freedom. They were not acknowledged at all. They were seen as rebels. They were seen as savages, as rogues. But the only thing they were doing, they were fighting for their own self-governance. What that meant socially, it meant the uprooting of indigenous, enslaved, and indentured people. As it's also my own history, my ancestry lays in India, also partly China, and I was enslaved and indentured through Dutch colonization for my ancestors to work in Suriname, the country where my parents are from. So that means a significant uprooting, and what happens when you uproot people and sever them from their history, they're prone to oppression and colonization again and again and again. So this is also a really interesting part, because Europe always talks about its enlightenment, its science, its poetry, its grandness, its modernity, and so forth. But what that meant for the rest of the world, there was an age of darkness. All these religious books, all these cultural books, all these poetry, colonialism did not want that to compete with their own version of the truth. So what that meant for non-Europe is there was an evident age of darkness. Every country that has been colonized will say otherwise than what the Europeans say. An example of that is in the Netherlands we have a frontman of the Dutch East India Company. His name was Jan Pieterszoon Koen, and he basically committed a genocide on the island of Banda in Indonesia. He murdered that whole island. I don't know exactly how many people were on that island, but he committed a genocide in that island. And in the Netherlands, his statue is still up. People in the Netherlands revere to him as a great sailor, as a great merchant, as a great businessman. But then when you go to Banda right now, they have a national holiday mourning the victims of that genocide. So this is the discrepancy that you see when you listen to the media of one side and when you listen to the media of both sides. That's why it's always important to see first responder media, decentralized media, and multiple perspectives of media. Then we'll go about Eurocentrism and whiteness. This is a more in-depth analysis of why Eurocentrism is so deeply embedded in science and whiteness as the vehicle of that. And let me see. When we talk about Eurocentrism, and I always find this funny, because if you look at the globe, it's not a perfect circle, it's like a little bit of an oval. And what that means is actually the only center of the earth can be the core. You know, there cannot be any way that Europe is the center of the world. But this is a colonial construction. If you look at pre-colonial maps, you'll see various different forms of maps where Europe does not always have to be in the middle. But why are all the maps that we see today constructed in such a way that Europe is in the middle? Because all the merchant routes of all the colonial ships went through that through the world in constructing that Europe is the center of enlightenment, it's the center of modernity, it's the center of riches, and they popularized that. So what you then see in Eurocentrism, Europe being in the middle, you see all these trade routes in which they consolidated their profits, in which they consolidated their science, and so forth, and so forth. And that came with the idea of it being the center of the world, it being the owner of all the riches. There's this modernity, there's this infrastructure that people all over the world still believe. I speak to colleagues and other people that visit the Netherlands pretty often, and they're like, oh, you have escalators and you have elevators and the best technology. But what people oftenly don't understand, the history behind it and what it cost. So you then also see it is the center of knowledge, it's the center of science, and it's the most civilized in the world. While all the colonial efforts have been nothing but barbaric. Then, this is actually an example. So I was also a consultant for a while. and gave advice. And a higher institution, an higher education institution within the Netherlands had hired me. And they asked me, in the Netherlands, we're talking about the colonial history right now and decolonization. Can you do a session for our management team? So this was in a corner of the Netherlands, so there was a lot of Dutch people, a lot of Dutch Caucasian people there in the management team. And I was the only person of Surinamese descent. And it was so funny because we started with whiteness. So when you look at whiteness, whiteness is a construction, right? So I asked them, what does whiteness mean for you? And this was a European, Dutch, Caucasian management team. So they were very polite to me, and they said, they named all these things. Whiteness is being a savior, being spiritual, pure, monogamous, scientific, innocent, enlightened, rational, and neutral. But what the funny thing was, is I asked them, do you also know the effects of whiteness? So then I showed them this. So the premises in the Netherlands, we call whiteness blank. So it's not the skin tone of being fair-skinned, but it's the ideology behind it constructing a superior position of domination. So what whiteness then means on one side is, okay, helper, spiritual, pure, superior, monogamous, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. But when you simply take the inverse again, the same trick, the linguistical inverse, and you put that on non-white, right? You see that the helper makes the helpless. The spiritual makes the tribal. The pure makes the unpure. The superior makes the inferior. The monogamous makes the wretched. The innocent makes the suspicious. The enlightened makes the ungodly. The rational makes the irrational. The neutral makes the biased. These are narratives we still see up until this day. And I know we're diving deep into history right now, but the same problems that we face when we talk about diversity and inclusion are pretty much what we see when we talk about non-whiteness. So the ideology, the colonially constructed ideology behind a fair skin tone, and European features for that matter. So we're gonna then go on a little bit of a timeline, because it is important to understand history as what brings us to the sum of our reality right now. So there was an age of pre-colonialism. See the world as ever-changing, right? There have been many empires, there have been many genocides, there have been many conquests, but we're just dealing with the most recent one, right? This forms our reality as of today. So the time before colonialism, which we call the pre-colonial era, is before 1450. So before we see the exploration phases, before we see the discovery phases from Columbus, and also the more explicit colonial phases. So in pre-colonialism, you say the state in which whiteness and colonial modes, effects, and attitudes have not perpetrated non-Europe. So those ships haven't sailed out. Those ships didn't go on exploration yet. So then, when you talk about 1450, then you see an era of colonialism. An era of colonialism that arguably still stems till today. The Netherlands still has colonies. They call it foreign territories right now. If you look at the US, it's the same. If you look at Puerto Rico, that's deemed a foreign territory. They make new words about it, but it's actually still a colony, right? So you have this 600 years of explicit colonial domination all over the world, affecting everything, affecting geopolitics, affecting life to its very last cell. What we then now start to see, and this is pretty interesting because in the movie we saw 1962, the independence of Algeria, right? So what decolonization used to mean is getting the colonizer out of your country, right? So there is a geographical decolonization. There's also a geopolitical decolonization. That was the first part of decolonization that has started, that says these countries need independence. Their people need their right to self-determination back in their own hands. So, then you see that decolonization firstly started with geopolitical and geographical decolonization. And what we're now talking about is mental decolonization, is infrastructural decolonization. So how do you go from a colonial infrastructure that has oppressive mechanisms, again, when we talked about racism, patriarchy, sexism, that have deeply rooted from the colonial ideologies, how do we build different constructions for these categories that have been colonially originated? Then you come to the concept of decoloniality. This was invented from Asia, mainly from Indonesia, India, Hong Kong, as well as being colonized. That says decoloniality is the state in which subjugation and exploitation as the result of whiteness and Eurocentrism, as colonial instigations and effects are fully in awareness and not permitted to dominate. So domination is a real key word in this, not to dominate. So how do we go from decolonial efforts to a state of decoloniality? This might be a little bit far away, you know, but it gives a point on the horizon where we can move towards as humanity as a whole. So not as colonizer and colonized, but humanity as a whole. So why is then there decolonization? Why are people decolonization? What are the effects on diversity and inclusion? Because when you talk about diversity and inclusion, without decolonization, we cannot understand why these mechanisms affect us. And to understand why these mechanisms affect us, we have to acknowledge history. Then, again, institutional racism as a colonial inheritance. Here, yesterday, and this is why I started with the intersectionalities yesterday, because oftenly we can see it as, oh, it's just a scientific idea that has been made and some people just made it up and now we're going to make everybody more happy by being more equal, right? But it's not that simple. Many of these intersectionalities are colonial concepts. They have been colonially created. Race didn't exist before colonialism. So if you look at these intersectionalities, yesterday we talked about disadvantages, but there is a construction creating these disadvantages and upkeeping them. So when we talk about the intersectionality of gender, there is the coloniality of patriarchy in it. That is a model that has been popularized by Europeans. Again, with sexuality, there has been many different sexualities all over the world, revert to in many different ways, but the European template went for heterosexuality based on a Christian model. So what you then see, I heard from a colleague of mine from India that there were multiple various different sexualities, but under British colonial rule, they made all those different sexualities outlawed and to be persecuted. All over the world, you have many similar instances. In Native American communities, you can talk about two-spirited people, so people that are not male energies or female energies, and also under colonial rule, these people have been banned from their communities, persecuted, and even killed. Then when you talk about religion, you see that indeed Christianity was dominant in its, I would say, weaponization by Europe. And there is a interesting phenomenon, and you can look it up. I highly recommend you to look it up. It is called Manifest Destiny, which is the European Christian concept, which basically says the European Christian right to self-determination means that you can go anywhere and anywhere where you want. So that is how the US has been colonized, and its native indigenous people have been genocided out of that country. Then when you look at ethnicity again, you see racism and various other forms of racism. You see Afrophobia, Islamophobia, and so forth and so forth. These are all colonial mechanisms. When we saw the movie Battle of the Algiers, you cannot other people without the construction of race, without the construction of Islamophobia. And then what we talked about in the previous slides, making them ungodly, making them ratchet, making them biased, making them... So these are very severe mechanisms that we still see today, right? And then socioeconomic class. This is also an example that I take from the creation of the stock market in Amsterdam, is that colonialism was used actually for the social upward mobility of Europeans. Colonialism ensured that when you are born into a certain class or a social class within Europe, that you had the opportunity to invest and go into various colonialities to make sure you have a better life. So there is this one example of a cleaner in Amsterdam. This is a very famous example. That says this cleaning lady wanted better for her life. And what she did is she invested in the stocks that came from the Dutch East India Company. So she got a better opportunity at social upward mobility. But what you then see for colonially inflicted people, and nowadays we'll call as migrants or colonial migrants, that are the mechanisms that oppress them. Those mechanisms keep them in impoverished situations. So then if you look at physical abilities and mental abilities in a colonial framework, these people were seen as witches and as they should just be killed off because they are not effective for the colonial machines. And then age, we can leave that out because there is not sufficient science on that there is a colonial distinction between ages. I mean, it was about power, and kids had a very different role in that time. But you can see that the intersectionalities that we talked about yesterday have very deep colonial disadvantages to them. So all these disadvantages that we talk about worldwide come from a history of colonialism. Then, migration and decolonization. Again, I want to refer to a quote, as I am Surinamese myself and have heritage in India and China. A colleague of ours from UC Berkeley, his name is Dr. Stephen Smalls. He's now, I believe he's not a professor anymore, but he said a very famous quote with regards to colonialism. He said, "You are here, we are here because you were there." And that means that there is this question always when people migrate to the West, why is there a migration problem? And why are migrants destroying this country? How do they end up here? Because Europeans were there first. If Europeans didn't head out and set sail and settle in the US and colonize pretty much all the outskirts of the world, people would not have any incentive to migrate to these countries. And there you see again the research that I highlighted in the beginning. So the concept of social forgetting, the concept of erasing these histories before colonial times or erasing histories about colonial perpetrations makes a big cognitive dissonance that is causing a lot of trouble when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and deeper. So then, awareness and effects of colonialism. What you often see with people that have this oppression in their lived experience is that they are aware of it on many different levels. You see here the personal dimension, the communal dimension, the societal dimension, the institutional dimension, the systematic dimension, and the ecological dimension. On all these dimensions, people that have been colonially oppressed or colonially migrated, they see these points of pain, they understand it from various different ways. But then what you see right now in the world, there is more decentralization of media, if you look at social media. So people start to understand these colonial narratives and how colonialism still perpetrates till today. So you see that the starting point, and this is also a good point to strategize media around and how to frame all these stories, is that there is a societal awareness. A couple of years ago in Western context, it started with the murder of George Floyd in the US, which an American officer stood on the neck of an African American man, and therefore he was killed by this officer. But what that outrage sparked was a very anti-colonial movement that said African people in the US have been oppressed since forever, since they were brought to the US to work as slaves, right? So you see this very anti-colonial narrative coming back. The same holds of today when we talk about Palestine, right? Because the colonization started happening already from 1948. And what is seen right now, or what is framed as Western media as a war, or October 7th, that it started on October 7th, is actually starting the story in the middle, which is evidently from all the evidences here, the scientific evidences, cultural evidences, and so forth. You cannot start the story in the middle. So people are starting to see the history behind it, starting to go about that in various ways. So, let's see. So, yeah, decolonization is not new. Decolonization has existed the moment that the right of self-determination was scrutinized of people all over the world, so the people that have been colonized. So what is an interesting idea, then I speak with scholars from all over the world about decolonization, and then you see various different movements. And then in Africa, you talk about Africanizing the university. Why is that? Because the native people of Africa are Africans. And what has happened is all these colonial infrastructures, all these colonial ways of science have also been embedded there. If you look at the countries, France basically owns a bunch of Africa, and Africa still has to pay reparations to France, which is very twisted. Because why does a colonized people have to pay reparation to its colonizer? Then, when you talk about North America, you talk about indigenizing the university and also decolonizing the university. And we must understand that a university is a colonial mechanism. All these the missions and missionaries came, were educated from universities as well. So what you then talk about indigenizing means if the original population has not been genocided or mixed with Europeans. So another example then, if you look at Argentina, Argentina is very much mixed between Europeans and indigenous people. So there you talk about decolonizing. And what decolonizing means is, okay, there is the evidence that people are mixed, which is fine, that's just the reality that we live in, but we must go away from the colonial mechanisms that still affect and oppress people. Then, when you talk about Asia, this is very important, because if we look about geopolitically about Kyrgyzstan, we have India that has a significant colonial history. We look at China that has a significant colonial history, and also Indonesia that has a significant colonial history. And what is beautiful in Asia, that you see that people are constructing a post-colonial image, because there is still a pre-colonial image that has not been wiped out through colonialism. In Africa, you see that the pre-colonial image has been wiped out. Many of Africa's history, and also personal history, countries, regional, tribal histories, have been wiped out, blatantly destroyed by Europeans. But when you look at Asia, you can still construct a pre-colonial image. So in Asia, this pre-colonial image is used to construct a post-colonial and decolonial image. And then the most important part, because decolonization as a concept is now in real time landing in Europe. It has existed in the US already for a while because the US is a settler colony, but Europe is the origin of colonialism. Western Europe, especially Western Europe, is the origin of colonialism. So what does then decolonization means in the place where colonialism has been invented? So we're still at the beginning of this. This is a emerging scientific field. In our country, in the Netherlands, I have the privilege to know these professors personally, but there are now special chairs for these professors to look at decolonization from a geopolitical perspective, from a societal perspective, from an economic perspective. And this is just the start of what decolonization can mean for the origin of colonialism, which is Europe. That we also see in the crowd right now. What we saw before the lunch, we saw a little bit of resistance, right? We saw a little bit of bridges that had to be built. And just know this is natural to the process, right? These differences are there, but the fact that we can address them and still do it in a decent way. I feel that is the strength what diversity and inclusion gives us, that we can address the differences but still have a form of inclusion that everybody is treated fairly. These are the same rules that we started with when we were talking about the safety rules. This is why it's so important to ensure safety, even though we might be a little bit uncomfortable. That's why our slogan was getting comfortable with the uncomfortable so we can ensure safety for everyone. So right now what we will do, we will go on. Decolonization is over, so that was a very political, very moving. We can also see that everybody was also emotionally moved by it, because history is always a complex thing, right? It's never simple and it's never just straightforward. It has many layers of complexities that translate itself all over the world in many different ways, as also in this university. So what we're going to do right now, this is the last part of the workshops that I will facilitate. So after these 2 days, this is actually the last part. What we're going to do right now is strategize diversity and inclusion. Because what was one of my goals and also one of the reasons why Erasmus Plus got in contact with us and we got, at least I got the opportunity here to speak for you, is to make diversity and inclusion practical in such a way that when I leave, that you can do something with it, that you can adjust the frameworks, that you can adjust your policies, that you can also figure out a way to continue this by yourself. So, going then on, strategizing diversity and inclusion in higher education. So a little recap of all theory. So what we saw over the 2 days, these theories are just frameworks. These theories are the infrastructure that will allow us to make equitable and inclusive policy. So then, from the beginning, we had the safe space rules. Again, to respect, actively listen, have mindful language, challenge our biases, have confidentiality, open-mindedness, empathy, and no judgment. Yes? Ooh. What shall we do? I don't know. We have to ask the camera people because they want me to. Because otherwise this thing doesn't work. Yes. Shall I just stand in the middle? Then I need to take this. But then you have to tell the camera person not to be mad at me. All right. Yes, we're going to go on from the middle. Here, so we have, of course, our safe space rules. I hope this clicker works from here. And then diversity and inclusion. We were talking about the differences between diversity and inclusion. We see that diversity is the mix. Remember our picture of the cake. Inclusion is making the mix work. Is there questions? Oh. Let's see this. Yes, again. Can you see when I'm standing here? Okay. Okay, so diversity is indeed the mix and inclusion is making the mix work. If the clicker just wants to work for me one thing. Yes, and then we go about equality and equity, and that was really beautiful what we saw yesterday. When I asked everybody who thinks that everybody is equal, the majority of the room raised their hands. But then when we went deeper into it, then we saw that not everybody is equal. Actually, nobody is equal, right? So we need to go towards a framework of equity. And equity basically says that everybody should have equal opportunity. Nobody is equal, but everybody should have a form of equal opportunity that leads to success. So here you can see an outcome of that again. So when you talk about equality, you give generic measures. So everybody will get the same box. But when you take a look at equity, so equal opportunity to a form of success, then you see that we have to make specific policy. We have to make specific programs for specific issues. Yes, I do not know what is happening. I will just wait 1 second. Yes. Yeah? Can I go on? Okay. Oh. So then we went about the intersectionalities again. Today we trained with the intersectionalities from a historical perspective. We then see the intersectionalities of gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, culture, race, socioeconomic class, physical abilities, mental abilities, and age. They all come with their privileges and disadvantages. And what I found strong of the workshop that we just did, that we see that it's not only working towards the most positive things and wiping out everything that's negative. It's always in a balance, and it's always a complex situation. What we also just saw, that there is a combination of all these intersectionalities. And when we talk about the combination of all those intersectionalities, you see that you get a human experience and a human positionality out of that. Right? Because nobody is just their gender, nobody is just their age, nobody is just their sexuality. Everybody is a certain way of complexity of all these things together. Then right now, a little recap of what we did today. We went into the historical aspect of diversity and inclusion, which shows a very strong decolonial fundament. So what are the points in history that created the world that is today, that created these categories that we call diversity and inclusion, and also our life and our academic life today? So decolonization here said acknowledging and undoing colonial injustices, because the last thing that we want to do is procreate these colonial injustices. Then here they are very much summarized. So we had the safe space rules, diversity and inclusion, equity and equality and equity, intersectionality, and decolonization. So what we will do right now, actually I will explain this first. This is a model that I have developed together with my team from my university. I hope everybody can see it. It's still in Dutch, so I will translate it in real time for you. How we go about an intersectional approach within our university. As I said, and I ran the statistics yesterday again, we indeed have 30,000 students in our university, and we have 5,000 international students, and we have 5,000 staff. So when we see the logo in the middle, that stands for Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, we see that we're not only an organization, right? And this is something that is really important, because a university is not just a building, or it's not just a bunch of people that get together. A university is an organization, but also a community. When you house 40,000 people, and 40,000 people are part of what you say is science or your campus or community, then that is definitely a community aspect to it, but it's also a movement, right? So something that picks up the speed within the university also has its effect on business and the society. So when we start from the middle, we go outward. So we had to connect diversity and inclusion to very concrete cases. So what we make diversity and inclusion hard for is that everybody has equal rights and equal opportunities. Here you can see that equity point of view again. So this, you must see this, we call it the impact circle of diversity and inclusion. This is what we take to our strategic meetings, or to when we want to explain why diversity and inclusion is important to different faculties, to partners, stakeholders, and so forth. So equal rights and equal opportunities. And then the second one there is visibility and representation. And this goes about where do you see this diversity and inclusion working? You want to have equal representation through your whole institution, from the bottom all the way to the top. Because what we see right now in our university is that we have a very diverse student population, but the management layer, so the employees, staff upward, is not diverse at all. So to make sure that everybody is seen and heard and also can represent themselves, we put visibility and representation as our second point in our core points of diversity and inclusion. And then the third one, it says being critical about your own ideologies. What can often happen when you have a monoculture, especially in scientific and academic environments, is that it can become very dangerous when it's a vacuum. When everybody agrees with each other, when everybody tries to be decent to each other, you don't create different experiences. So we need to be able to look in the mirror with a critical voice. Are we operating from a vacuum, or are we also including people that can challenge these perceptions and these statements that we say is equitable? Right? So then we go to the outer layer, so the dark blue layer, and it starts, in Dutch it says bewustwording, and that means awareness. It says awareness, policy development, and action. So this is a circle. I will stand here real quick so you can see it better. This is a circle of action, right? So if you talk about diversity and inclusion, what we then see within our university, that not everybody is ready for it, right? There's different readinesses in different faculties, in different services. As you might imagine, within humanities and social sciences, people are aware of it, and people also understand what policy makes. So what this middle layer allows us to do is check on which stage the stakeholders or partners within the university are. So let's say they do not have significant knowledge, but they want to work with it. Then we say they're on the awareness stage. We have to build in a certain awareness that this is playing. We see this a lot in our beta faculty, Faculty of Exact Sciences, and also School of Business and Economics. It's a little bit further. So when we're on the stage of policy development, we're talking about humanities, social sciences, also that part of the business faculties. And then action. This is very important because what we said on the first day, that inclusion is an action. Inclusion is not a theory. It's definitely manifested in the infrastructure. So in these three, the division of these three action points, we can measure where the faculty is or where that team is or the stakeholders is in terms of the stage of diversity and inclusion. So when we go to the outer ring, so this beige ring right here, we have put 6 impact points. And these are points that we stated that will make diversity and inclusion workable, practical, but also make sure that we have a vision and a clear direction that we want to go through. So I'm going to go through them one by one. And it says the VU recognizes individual differences. It needs to recognize individual differences, because if it doesn't recognize these individual differences, as we had with our workshop right now, you do not know where you need to go. You do not know what to base your data on. You do not know what you need to deliver. After that, we want to have inclusive curricula. That's why it's also really important when I was talking about decolonization. What is the origin of this curriculum? What is the epistemology, the framework of theory underneath what we're teaching? What is the methodologies? What are the pedagogies underneath it? Are they actually inclusive, and how do we measure that? Then upside down we said the VU is a front runner in diversity and inclusion. That's also one of the reasons why I came here from the Netherlands, from my university, because the VU invests a lot in diversity and inclusion, and there's in our university over 200 active researches going on on the topic of diversity and inclusion. So we house a lot of research and programming on diversity and inclusion. Then this upside down one is really beautiful as well. It says the VU's facilities and infrastructures should be accessible to all physical and mental abilities. Here again, you can see it's a point on the horizon, and you can steadily work towards it. So then this one here, the VU processes, let me read it right. Yes, the VU processes, internal processes and outward-facing processes, are built on the foundation of equitability and justice. This is very important because there's also a legal side to this that has to be acknowledged. And then the last one is also pretty practical. It says the employees' diversity should reflect the student diversity. And what that means is, can your students find themselves in the staff? Can your students have that conversation with them? Can they see themselves being also part of the staff? Because if your students cannot see themselves being part of the staff, then we're doing something very wrong as an institution, because then we're taking chances away from them, which is opposite of diversity and inclusion. Then the outwardmost layer, and this is the practical layer, where we start is the products and activities of the diversity office. And this is, I will give a little bit of a background knowledge on the construction. So as I told you, the diversity office of the VU works right beneath the board of executives. So the rector magnificus, the vice president, and the chair of finances. So we work for all these 40,000 people. And we're a relatively small team. We're with only 7 people, with the specialties or of their portfolios of campus and community. We have a diversity officer, campus and community. We have a diversity officer, decolonization, which I am. We have a diversity officer, education. We have a diversity officer, research. And we have a diversity officer, HR, so the hiring process. So what we have is then the products and activities of our small diversity office. But as you might understand, we cannot change the institution with only 7 to 10 people. Right? So what we then need to do is we have change agents. So within every faculty and every service, we have people that we work with that are also specialists on the field of diversity and inclusion. Because you must understand, diversity and inclusion means something else for the medical faculty than what it means for social sciences, what it means for business. So you need experts that have expertise in their field, but also expertise in diversity and inclusion. So what is our goal is to facilitate these change agents. How do you orchestrate it in such a way that you have all these people with their respective knowledges and respective expertises in the faculties and services? Then when you have these people, we look at the programming of the faculties and the services. What do they do? How do they use that money that they get from the executive board? How do they use their funds? How do they write it in their year plans, in their multi-year plans? How do they write it in their strategic plans? So we can assess all those things and take it in as data. And then the last point, ultimately it should lead to some form of impact, right? So let's say I'll have a example of the medical faculty. Within the medical faculty, their curriculum is based on a colonial epistemology. Medicine is a very colonial study, as is accounting, as is anthropology, and a couple more of them. They're very colonial. So what the aspiration there is how do you change it in a comprehensive way without disrupting students going to school in real time? We oftenly compare it to a mechanic, right? When a mechanic is servicing a car, they turn off the engine, and then you service the car engine, right? You can take the mechanism apart. But imagine the car engine running, and you have to service the engine, and you have to take car parts out of it. It's a very complicated issue. you know, to go about that in real time. So within this whole framework, we go from what the essence of the university should be, our strategy towards diversity and inclusion, making it practical, measurable, and tying it to a clear vision and mission. So that is a little bit about this. What we're then going to do right now, take that previous slide as maybe a point of inspiration, but if we talk about higher education, and this is the most specific part and also the last part of this 2-day seminar and workshop, what we see is then education. What we see as the practical facets of education or the curriculum. You see an epistemology, so the theory behind knowledge, the framework underneath knowledge that supports what we even see as knowledge, right? We see the pedagogies. What are our forms of teaching? What are the things that we even consider as pedagogy? The methodologies, and then an outcome of those, also the curriculum. Then we have research. For now, we will not dive deeper into research, because this, as I understood, is not a research institution. Then we have HR, which is very critical, because HR basically means how do you attract new people, or how do you go about the people within your company or institution. There we see the pool. So from which pool are you getting these people? Is it the same privileged pool that graduates, or the same? This is the same vacuum that I was talking about from the impact circle. Can you look critically in the mirror and say, hey, we're working from a vacuum, and I don't think that's fruitful for society or the world, or academia for that matter. Then you have the hiring process, onboarding process, and then also academic continuity. That touches again on the issue that we had at our university of, does the student body reflect the employees or teaching staff? If that is not the case, then there needs to be processes of academic continuity. Then we have campus and community. Physically, the university is a building where there are students, so there is a campus and there is a community in that. So what we then see as campus and community is the staff, student, campus accessibility, and the resources that are available. And also, last but not least, is leadership. This is sort of the last frontier of diversity and inclusion in the West. What I was talking about of my university, that there is a diverse student population but not a diverse management team or staff and upward. That is a very significant problem, because what you want is have accurate representation, and that also involves politics and strategy. So what we are going to do right now is the last part of this workshop, and that is I have divided all these 4 pillars which make up an institution. I have left research out for now, and I base these questions around it, right? What does inclusive education look like? Then we have the pillars of epistemology, pedagogy, and so forth. And I asked that question for every fundamental process right here. So what does inclusive HR, what does inclusive campus and community, and what does inclusive leadership look like? What we are going to do right now, again, we're going to go in 4 groups, and every group will be assigned 1 topic. We have learned about what is diversity and inclusion, so we should know by now what equitable and inclusive protocol or policy should be. So what I ask you, please give very practical and pinpoint examples of what you would say an inclusive epistemology would be. Let me name the curriculum right now as an example. What does inclusive education look like in terms of curriculum? How do you represent all the students within your classroom within the curriculum? Are their histories represented? Are they equitably represented? Are they also represented in the research that they read? Are they also represented in the languages that they speak? So that is just one example of that. If we then name another example, maybe from campus and community, the resources, right? Are all these resources accessible to all the students? Do we maybe see that students of a lower socio-economic status cannot even find these resources while they're made for them? You know, these are things that happen in real life. Also, maybe the campus accessibility. Yesterday, we went deeply on that. How do we ensure that students with different physical and mental abilities still have equal and equitable opportunities? And then the question for leadership, an example might be, how do we make sure that a representation is guaranteed, right? So that you don't speak about people, but you speak with people. So you're not making decisions for people, but you're making decisions with people.